Welcome to Helping Organisations Thrive. Today I have the great pleasure of Georgie Rudd on the show. Good morning to you and welcome, Georgie.
Good morning. Thanks very much for having me.
It's great to have you on the show. You are an accredited executive coach and you've got over 20 years of business experience leading talent and development functions for leading global organisations. But now you lead your own sort of coaching, training and consulting practice, Rudd Coaching. And I love your headline on LinkedIn, and it's particularly pertinent to our conversation today. Your headline is helping people to listen and think better. And we will be talking a bit more about that and how we can actually listening is helping people to think as well. But before we get into that conversation, I'd love to know what you love about what you do, Georgie.
Thank you. Yeah, I think being in the position I'm in, working very often with leaders in the flow of very busy, demanding jobs, it is a real privilege to be able to help them to slow down and create a space for them to do some high quality thinking. And so I suppose what I really love is helping people get clear on what it is they really want, and then starting to peel back the layers a bit in terms of the issues behind the issues. So very often where we start is not where we end. When we start to join the dots and understand a little bit about what's going on for that individual, there'll be some things that have maybe, they've just been walked past for a long time. And we start to get to know those things and start to right size them a bit, actually, so that they have the opportunity to see new ways forward. And I think that's it's always really exciting to see people have those aha moments. And then with the listening skills pieces that I do, I love again, helping people to have experiences that suddenly open up a whole new world to them in terms of small things they can do that can make a massive difference when they're talking to other people.
It's interesting you talk about listening there and what you do with your sort of workshops and things that have that experience. Share with me a little bit more about experiencing listening, because it's probably an odd concept for people to think about. That how can you experience it, and the experience of listening and the power of that, and how that sort of starts to do some great stuff.
Yeah, well, I think it's possibly interesting to sort of talk about how did I get here? Why am I interested in this? And I think some of that comes from 20 years in corporate careers and being on the receiving end of some pretty poor listening experiences, actually, and observing those around me with other teams, and seeing the knock-on effect of that. And so when we think about listening, I mean, there's a sense really that nobody really teaches us how to do that. I think some people are predisposed, or they have experiences that help them learn that naturally, and others not so much. And it is a skill that can be learned. And I'm really interested in why that's important for organisations and why it's important for leadership. I think if we stop and think, we've all got experiences of having a poor listening experience. We can think of that. We can actually recall it often very quickly because it's stayed with us. And if we think about, well, how did that make me feel? And then what happened as a result? And often when I'm talking to clients, there is a real recognition there of saying, yes, I've got several experiences of that, actually. And the sorts of words people will use is, it made me feel small. It made me go quiet. I felt angry. I felt misunderstood, not heard. I withdrew my intellectual capital. I withdrew my motivation. So it's really interesting helping people to almost stop and examine something that we kind of take for granted, actually. It's not something we tend to talk a lot about in the flow of work, but it's the single most important part of communication. And, in organisations full of human beings, it's a really interesting thing to explore.
And why I've experienced that myself, and we've all probably experienced that, somebody's talking to you whilst they're looking at the phone or looking somewhere else, or they're ready to jump in with a question and literally not listen to you at all. They just want to come up with their idea. And we've all experienced it, how it makes you feel not listened to, and you don't feel very valued. How have organisations got to this place where are still in that place where they're struggling to listen and struggling to see the value in listening? Because it's a positive thing. It's a proactive thing. It's an intervention, actually. It's a tool, actually. It's not just it's a dialogue and we communicate, we speak, and then we hear and listen. Actually, it's a tool in itself. So how have we got this far in organization that we're still having these issues with communication and listening?
Yeah, well, I think there's a few things I see that really stand out. And one is the concept, I think, of how we are all programmed to feel we add value. And actually, what does adding value look like in an organization? And I really believe a lot of us, very much include myself here, that we are sort of hardwired to feel that the way we add value is to advise, to tell, to give opinions, actually to have all the answers, particularly so in a client-facing organization where you're there to help solve clients' problems. So there's a sense of I add value by working in this way, and it's quite a flip. Actually, it's quite a shift for people to potentially put ego into the back seat for a while and consider they can add value by creating a space for somebody else to do good thinking. That actually other people have got immense wells of resourcefulness and ideas and innovation. And I think the other thing is time. People are very time poor. In demanding jobs, and it can seem like listening is a sort of luxury. Don't have the time to spend doing that. But what we're discovering in the listening labs that I run as part of the work we do is people seeing in the space of even 10 minutes when they're applying some of these learned tips, tricks, behaviours around bringing high quality attention and asking good questions, even in 10 minutes. The nature and the quality of that interaction is phenomenally different, and so there's a sense of, if I can do that in 10 minutes, well, perhaps that there's something in this.
Yeah, and I think it's having opportunities like you creating those spaces for it to actually see the value of pausing, listening, and seeing the response you get from it. I remember doing my coach training, and we did a whole thing on listening to each other. Obviously, as coaches, we do a lot of listening as part of what we do, and we had to do like a 5-minute listening with each other to a dilemma. So we had to share a dilemma, and the other person had to listen, and the other person couldn't say a word. All they could do was nod and sort of gesture that they were listening. But it was interesting as people started to share after 2 or 3 minutes that dilemma. Then they started to create their own solutions and ideas. And at the end of it, they'd already almost solved that dilemma. And so, just the power of allowing somebody to talk and share, and obviously intently, valuably listening, was almost creating the solution, and the person didn't have to say anything. And you know yourself, we've been in coaching sessions where people have shared stuff and they've created their own actionable plan because they've had a time to think, and you've created that space. And so it's powerful. And so I got a quote by Nancy Klein. Obviously, it talks a lot about listening and people's thinking, and I like it. And it's I'd like you to sort of give your thoughts on this and why this is probably true. The quality of your attention determines the quality of other people's thinking.
It's a beautiful quote from Klein, and I, like you, am hugely inspired by her work. I think time to think has so much application for workplaces. I love that quote also because I think it's easy to underestimate the impact that your listening has on somebody else, and it can be quite a sort of mindset shift to think that purely in terms of the quality of listening you're offering, somebody else is either going to become more intelligent or less intelligent. Klein will talk about people when they're very conscious they're not really being listened to, and it can be subtle, but you know you're not being listened to. You might start to see somebody stumble over their words a bit, to sort of scramble around a little bit, to think less clearly. And the flip, the reverse is true. When people are in a space where they know they're not going to get interrupted, they're going to be heard, somebody is almost thinking with them, they're a thinking partner, as Klein would call it, then they're accessing all sorts of deeper thoughts than they would ordinarily be able to do. And when you sort of pair up high attention and really brilliant questions, we start to re-examine the role of questions. Often we think of questions as a way to gather data, to find out for ourselves, to follow our own curiosity. But actually thinking about questions as a tool for really provoking deeper thoughts to help somebody else again, it's a really interesting thing to see how people either, expand or contract.
Yeah, it's quite powerful, really, and it is a vital tool in leadership. So how do we, and you're doing it, part of what you're doing already, but how do we change that narrative in organizations with leaders that to see listening as just as valuable, if not more important, than actually just talking yourself or advising or being the sort of adding the value piece, or the sort of driven probably predominantly by ego. But how do we change that narrative?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing to note is that listening has a place, and it doesn't need to be the default mode for every interaction. I suppose what I'm interested in is, have you got the ability to flex when it counts the most? So to be able to flex the listening muscle. In some conversations, there are definitely times when listening is not going to be the right response. If someone's got a simple question they need an answer, they'd like to hear the answer. So there's something about judgment and about feeling brave enough and confident enough to flex the listening muscle. And then I think, one way to look at this for organizations is, how do they know, and how do individuals know that they have good listening skills? What tells them that they are listening well? And how, if they're not listening well, is that manifesting in the organization? And I would say there are several things that might be, if you like, indicators or symptoms of a poor level of listening. So meetings, you think about the nature of the meetings in your organization. Are they purposeful? Do you feel that they're really time well spent? Are meetings talking shops, or are they, a default kind of round of status updates? Do the same people speak every time? So what's the quality of the meetings in the organization? Because that will tell you a lot about how much listening is going on. Other areas would be around inclusion, for example. So do people feel they can be themselves? Engagement, do people feel they are heard in the organization or in their team or with their manager or leader? What about hybrid working? How's that working? Is there a sense of psychological safety? Do people feel able to say what they really need to say? What about innovation? Are organizations seeing great ideas bubble to the top? People being actively given a space to share that. Or team effectiveness. That's definitely an area you and I share in common. How are those teams working? What are the dynamics in that? Right up to a kind of macro level on strategy development. So how is strategy being developed in organizations? Is it in silos, or is there, a willingness to kind of be curious and to listen to what's happening in other parts of an organization? So there's all sorts of things. If we sort of almost looked at it the other way around and said, what's not working for us that well? Where has listening, where is it a real accelerator? Where can it make a big difference? And I think, if people are even 20% better able to listen, we don't need to aim for something completely unrealistic. That can have a real knock-on to the quality of relationships and strategic conversations and collective working.
Yeah, I think that's a good way, because there's no real measure as such, and we don't want to get into KPIs of how much people are listening, because that just probably get ridiculous, wouldn't it? But I think it's good to have that indicative. How are we performing at innovation? How are our team meetings are performing? How are individuals feeling in terms of sharing? And it's probably a bit of gut feel, but that's probably okay. It doesn't have to be always a hard measure sometimes in life. You mentioned, I think, quite an important thing about psychological safety, because as much as you might create, as much goes to environment, create an environment for people to share, and because obviously if you're listening, somebody else is speaking, and obviously you want people to speak as honestly as they feel comfortable. And so how do we create that psychological safety then? Because I think it's quite an important, almost foundation, really, in creating those listening moments, I guess.
Yeah, I think there's a huge amount within psychological safety that's reliant on curiosity. So in conversations and relationships, what is the level of genuine interest of one person in another person and their opinion? There's you've probably seen the trust equation before, which is a really interesting way to look at how is trust created. So you've got the elements of credibility and reliability, but then also intimacy, which is an interesting word, but is there some intimacy in that relationship? And if you add all those things up and put them over the kind of divider of self-interest, then that's a really interesting way to look at trust. So, as a leader or a manager, or as a client-facing person, wanting to build trust with a client, we bring credibility and reliability relatively easily. I think we rarely stop to think about how we're creating moments of intimacy and demonstrating we're genuinely oriented towards the other person. And that's where listening plays a massive part. By really wanting to know, to ask good questions, to be prepared to give somebody the space to talk and to think. And there is an element of humility to that, I think. But it's really interesting, as I go around organisations, there is this sort of connection of people now starting to think this isn't just about our internal environment. This is also about our customers and our clients. How are we going to build brilliant, trust and safety there? So I think psychological safety, it's a word that's used a lot. And I think it's an interesting exercise to try and break it down and think, what are the ingredients to that? What's underneath that and underpins it? And I think, for example, how are you? We've seen that go around the internet a few times. Ask them twice. For somebody to be able to answer that honestly, they need to really feel you would like to know and that you're not judging. They don't need to be defensive. So the way we ask questions, I think, is quite important. One of the things we talk about from a coaching perspective, but also in the listening labs, is the simple shift in questions to be truly open. So rather than open but leading, really open questions that maybe start with a what or a how. We often default to why, but why's a really interesting.
Can be quite aggressive, can't it?
It can. It's all about tone.
Yeah.
So, an example, I can think of is, somebody may be asking a direct report, why are you not prioritizing that meeting? Now, that can be said with a lot of grace and interest and not judgment, but it can also sound like, why are you not prioritizing that meeting? But if you were to flip it to, what's holding you back from prioritizing that meeting? That's interesting. Actually, what is holding me back? What's going on there? So there's some subtle things we can do that I think just raise the level of psychological safety.
Interesting. I think you said it before, coupling the listening piece, which obviously creates that more intimacy, making people feel valued, but actually coupled with the right questions, because the right questions evoke the thought, the deep thinking, the insights. And it's not just the insights for you, because I think people forget, actually, when you ask somebody a question, you're creating insights for them in that process, and they're thinking about something because you've asked them an open question. And by open question, there's no judgment, there's no loadiness to it. It's genuinely an open, what do you think about it? How are you today? It's I'm really interested. And I think obviously the how are you piece, which often people just walk through the office, how are you? Yeah, I'm fine. And it's almost a stop. Actually, if you stop, I had a HR director who used to say to me, she used to walk around the office and go, how are you today, Julian? She should put it in a moment in time. And it made you think, and she just look, and she stand there and just look at you and pause and wait. And you felt, okay. And you have to think of a genuine response rather than just say, oh, I'm fine. She was genuinely interested. And the intervention of listening became quite a firmness to it as well, but she genuinely wanted to know, and I think that's important. So on the question piece, and how else can we help leaders who are listening right now to think, okay, I need to spend some more time listening, and we can talk a bit more about how to listen as well, but what about the question side of things? How else can we invoke those insights?
Yeah, well, I think that the choice of question is really important, as we've talked about, but also to recognise that brilliant, powerful questions are generated from really high quality listening. sometimes people will ask me, look, can I just have the list of really great questions? Have you got that kind of 101 of best coaching questions? It doesn't exist. There are definitely some ways to structure a question that helps somebody to have that provocative experience, but they come from the amount of attention that you're bringing. So you'll hear it, you'll hear the thing that gets repeated, or you'll hear the hesitation. And actually, if we are bringing really high levels of listening, so listening not being binary is another sort of misconception, I think, that I'm either listening or I'm not. Yeah, you could say there are 5 levels. We know that there are some great books that have explored that. So if level 5, which is really kind of empathic listening, is in place, you're also spotting what's not being said. It's almost important. So there's something about that in terms of the generation of the questions, but also pausing once a question has been asked. And I think that's really hard for most of us. A lot of us are uncomfortable with silence of any kind. For some people, we want to rescue them. It's quiet. Gosh, I don't want you to feel awkward, so I'll just keep talking. Whereas, Klein is great on that and will say, look, it might feel like it's quiet on the outside between you, but it's really noisy in that person's head. Like, let them think. So even a small pause, at 5 seconds after you've asked a question, can be a game changer for leaders, to resist that default mode and just give people some space. And I think these are the things I'm really interested in, is the incremental changes that people can make in their day-to-day lives, and yes, work, but also home. Now, I think about some of the quality of conversations I might have with my husband, for example, after a day, and I might say, how was your day? Or, what's going on today? And I'd like to say I'm bringing 100% of my attention to that. But, realistically, I'm not always. But it's an important moment to think, am I actually giving the people I care about the most my best attention? Multitasking, maybe you're making dinner, so these levels of listening are interesting, where I've had people come into the listening lab and say, I'm not a good listener. I just know that I'm going to find this really hard today, and maybe coming out with a different view, which is that I am able to listen really well, and actually I might have discovered I'm better listening in one-to-ones than I am in groups. I can now pay attention to that. So yeah, I think there's a lot around incremental changes that can just shift the dynamic of an interaction. And if you could multiply that around organizations, it's an exciting prospect, that we don't all need to have a coaching certificate. In many ways, that's unhelpful, but we can almost strip that back a bit, go back to basics around these everyday leadership experiences.
And I think that's what it is. It's those everyday moments, isn't it? It's not just about the meetings, the presentations, the client interactions. It's the everyday moments, and it's the marginal gains. Talk a lot about in elite sports, and it's marginal gains. And I know, I've got children. It's those moments of grabbing those moments when they do speak to you, when they're certainly in the teenager's time, and you grab those moments and just listen to them. and I often, when I used to pick my girls up late from parties, they'd just talk and everything else, and I just take the moment, just to be with them, build that relationship, but just listen. I didn't really have to say anything really. And I think that as leaders, we need to just grab those moments, and even if it's whatever, it's water cooler moments, lunch moments, just listen. And that doesn't have to be work related, does it? It can just be I'm interested in you, and it's showing that interest. And people love to be interested in themselves, as in, ask questions about what they did the weekend. Genuinely, how did you get on with that, and sharing stuff. And it's building that intimacy you talked about in terms of building that trust. And intimacy comes through relationship, comes through that genuine interest in somebody else. So before we finish, what sort of 2 or 3 things you would share with a leader that would help them right now to be a more effective, listen to this podcast right now, they go away and go, I'm going to take what Georgie said, those 2 or 3 things to make me a more effective listener in my workplace? I can't hear you, Georgie.
Can you hear me, Julian?
I can hear you now. Yes. Sorry. Yes.
I can't hear you, sadly.
Oh. Okay.
It's a real irony, given we're talking about listening.
No.
I'm unable to hear you.
Did it just go then, did it? Can you hear me now? Bear with me. Standard. Microphone.
I'm sorry.
That's all right. Can you hear me now? How about now? Can you hear me now? That's but and it was fine before. What's going on in 25? Okay. Why that's I say share free tips on
No joy.
Can you do you want to check your messages? You check your messages? No? Okay. Oh. Drums. Private chats. Is that gone? Oh. Can't try and think. Way to take that out. Can you hear me now? No. Settings. check your messages. Messages. I've typed a message. Right, I'll give you a call. Where's my phone? Oh, no, where's your phone?
Hi, Julian.
I can hear you, and I sent them some messages that you probably still not gotten through. But if you can just share 3 tips, or 2 or 3 tips, what a leader should do, and then that'll be finished. It's fine. Don't worry about it. I don't know what happened there, but you can't hear me. I don't know why. That's just very strange.
I can't hear you, and I was sort of saying the irony of that is we're talking about listening. So what a shame. I was really, really enjoying the conversation. But you asked about three things leaders could do that would maybe make a difference to their relationships and interactions. So I think that the first is...
If you start again, I'll take this off the call because I want to record this. So if you start again, and I'll take this off the call. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
I can.
You can still hear me.
I can still hear you, but I'll take this off. Yeah.
Okay. So it's an odd feeling knowing that I can't hear you, but you can hear me. But hopefully this is useful for anybody really in the world of work to be thinking about in conversations. So the first would be to just slow things down, to consider that if you just had 5 minutes to do something different at the beginning of the meeting, what could you change? So maybe fighting the default mode of wanting to ask about the particular project or the workload, but ask a more open question, a more provocative one with scope for others to really talk about what's most important to them. So being on their agenda would be a really good thing to do. The second is to really be mindful of what you've got around you. So not listening can be very subtle. You know, you could just be visibly distracted. It might be just checking the phone. It might be eyes all over the place. It might be that you're just thinking about the biggest problem you've got. So just stopping, resetting and thinking, I'm just going to give somebody the gift of really listening to them for a couple of minutes. And then questions. So really thinking and being thoughtful about your choice of questions, avoiding the temptation to ask the question that you think will lead them to the answer you've already got, but to start with a what or a how, and to give somebody time, so to pause after that.
Thank you very much, Georgie. That's been really helpful. Really good conversation. I know you can't hear me, but that's fine. Whether you can hear me say how we can get in contact with you, but what I will do, I will say goodbye, and we'll put all the details, how people can connect with you on LinkedIn and your websites. Really appreciated your time today. Thank you very much. I'll call you.